Story 1. Fear in the Farmhouse. A few years ago, my girlfriend Charlotte and I rented out a beautiful Airbnb in the foothills of the mountains in Colorado. The luxurious farmhouse, nestled in an expansive pasture with a picturesque backdrop of looming mountains, seemed like something lifted from a magazine. The cows grazed, the summer weather was amazing, and initially, we couldn't have been more pleased with our rental. The first day, we settled in, relaxed, and soaked in the ambiance. On the morning of our second day, as we sipped coffee by the window, I noticed a man out in the field tending to the cows. He was a fixture in the landscape, yet something about his presence felt, well, somewhat invasive. I noticed he kept glancing over at the house we were staying in. He'd tend to the cows a little bit, look over at us, tend to the cows a little bit more, then look over in our direction again. He did this over and over until finally, at one point, he leaned up against a fence post for a moment and just stared. His gaze seemed to pierce through the distance straight into our temporary residence. After a while, he finally tended back to the cows and eventually made his way out of view. As we went about our day, Charlotte noticed that we were going to need some more towels, especially if we were going to hit the hot tub later. "Did you check the closets?" I asked her. "Yeah, but I didn't find any," she replied back. So we reached out to our host for more towels, just before we planned to head into town for some exploring and shopping. Our host's response was apologetic and amiable, and she suggested that she would either have someone leave towels just inside the front door, or wait for our return. We told her it was no problem, thanked her, and headed into town. Upon our return, the absence of towels by the front door suggested no one had been by yet. But as Charlotte entered the master bedroom, she snapped back at what she saw. Towels were piled on the bed, dozens and dozens of them, in a display that felt almost mocking in its excess. We were unsettled not just by the intrusion into the privacy of the master bedroom, but by the silent statement made by the towel's presence. "What in the hell?" I asked. Is this normal?" Charlotte replied back. We tried to brush off our discomfort, attributing the disturbance to an overzealous host, and began preparing our meal for the night. Nevertheless, a growing sense of unease kept lingering around us as we progressed through our stay. As night fell, we cuddled up on the couch to watch a movie. It had been a long, active day for us, and eventually, I began to doze off. My sleep, however, was short-lived. Charlotte gasped sharply and jumped, jolting me awake. Her wide eyes were fixed on a window, where she swore she had seen someone peering in. My heart pounded as I jumped up, ran outside, and checked around the house, but there was nothing, only the quietness of the night. "Are you sure you saw someone?" I asked her. "I think so," she replied back. "I'm not sure." Not taking any chances, I ensured that all the doors and windows were locked, and we retired to the bedroom. "Try to get some sleep," I said to her. "It was a long day. We'll try to relax a little bit more tomorrow." The following day we tried to reclaim the peace we had come for, but there was something going on that we couldn't quite put our finger on. Little did we know at the time, but everything would come to a head that night. The deep silence of that night was shattered by an explosion of bangs on the windows, violent cursing coming from someone outside. A man, outside on the front porch, was belligerently screaming something about intruders in his house. Charlotte, petrified with fear, called out to me. "What do we do? What do we do?" "Get on the phone and call the cops," I said. As she did this, I jumped up and rushed over to the front of the house. "Whoever you are, get lost," I yelled out. "We've called the cops and they're on their way." The figure of a man that I could see outside stumbled back and forth and continued to curse at us. Eventually he appeared to turn and finally made his way into the darkness. Checking back with Charlotte, she was still in bed, a shaking mess. "They're on their way," she said to me. "Okay," I said back to her. "It looks like he's gone for now. Everything's going to be all right." While she continued to hold with the operator, I jumped on my phone and contacted the host. Multiple cars eventually made their way out, and an extensive search into the night found a man lying in the pasture. He was passed out drunk, beside him, an empty bottle of liquor. Standing by the house, we could eventually see the host making her way over. We stood at a distance and watched as she conversed with some of the police officers. At one point in the conversation, We could see her put her face in her hands and shake her head back and forth. We could barely make it out, but we could hear her saying, "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry for this." After a little bit more conversation, one of the cops motioned back towards us, and the host shook her head up and down and began to make her way over. Before we could even get a word out, she started apologizing profusely. She was a mess. She had been crying, and you could tell that the entire incident cut straight to her core. As she began speaking with us, everything began to fall in place. The man they found in the pasture was her brother. Ever since their father died the previous year, there had been a bitter feud between them about who owned the land, the livestock, and even the Airbnb that we were renting out. The two had done their best to work together and come to a resolution, but in the past few days, things took a turn for the worse and began to boil over. Her brother was the one in the pasture staring at the Airbnb the other day. He was the one who dropped off the excess of towels, and after more than a few drinks, the friction of the last few months became too much, and he exploded. It appears that we were in the wrong place at the wrong time, and got caught in the middle of a situation that had been brewing for some time. It was very late at night, and the host begged us to try to get some rest, and assured us that everything would be taken care of in the morning. Not really having anywhere else to go, we really didn't have a choice. In the morning, we got a call from the host. You could tell in her voice that she was still shaken by the whole ordeal. She said our full payment would be refunded and offered us an extended stay, free of charge. Charlotte and I thanked her for the refund, but our stay was done. It was one of the craziest experiences either of us had been through, and we just wanted to go home. In the end, we decided not to leave a negative review. The host was sincere about everything, and we figured she had enough to deal with in regards to her brother. We never found out what happened with him, and to be honest, we didn't really care. We just hoped that the host and her brother were able to work through their differences. After all, family should be more important than any chunk of land, or an Airbnb that sits on it. Story 2. The Guest in the Third Cabin. We had been planning this Airbnb getaway for months. 2 cabins on a remote property by the river, just for me, my girlfriend Jade, and our friends, another couple, Mark and Lisa. It sounded perfect, a chance to unwind and enjoy each other's company. We got there as the sun was setting below the horizon. The place had a total of 3 cabins. Jade and I would take one, Mark and Lisa would take the other, and as for the third, well, we weren't sure who was in the third cabin. There was a car parked outside though, so it appeared that someone was there. Not paying it much attention, we began settling into our cabins as night fell. Our cabins were cozy little 1-bedrooms with small kitchens and living areas, and small decks that overlooked the river in the distance. They had that countryside charm you see in travel magazines. The property was great too. There was a community campfire area down by the river, a picnic table, a small deck right on the river, and even a place to load canoes in if you wanted to do some floating. After settling in, we headed down to the campfire area. It was a beautiful night, and the sound of the water made for a perfect backdrop. We were cracking jokes, reminiscing about college days, and just really soaking in the moment. I remember looking over at the third cabin at one point. It was pitch black, no lights on, and no sign of life. "Kinda weird for a place with a car parked outside," I said, but we shrugged it off and got back to our stories and beers. We didn't know it at the time, but from that moment on, our adventure would begin to unravel. As we were sitting by the fire, enjoying each other's company, Lisa jumped in her seat a little bit and let out a gasp. We all looked over to see what had startled her. In the distance, just outside the campfire's light, was a man, just standing there, watching us. Recognizing that he had been noticed, he slowly made his way over to us. It was the guest in the third cabin. He was a rough-looking guy, and he looked on edge. He asked if he could join us, and we didn't want to be rude, so we said sure. But as he sat down, the vibe completely changed. The guy was odd, asking personal questions that felt too invasive for a first meeting. He had this intense look, making it hard to keep eye contact. We tried to be friendly, but it was tough. The fun atmosphere we had going took a nosedive. Eventually, it became so thick and oppressive that somebody had to do something. Finally, Mark spoke up. "Well, it's getting late. I think we're going to get to bed." As he said this, he gave me a look as if to non-verbally say, "You'd better do the same." I took the cue and indicated that Jade and I would be retiring to our cabin also. As we walked away, the man said 2 words, "Sweet dreams," and then just stared into the fire in a way that made all of us feel uneasy. After arriving back at the cabin, Jade and I talked about how creepy the man was, and then got ready for bed after making sure that the door was locked. Around 10 p.m., we finally fell asleep. A few hours later, around 1 a.m., I woke up on my own. I had this weird feeling in my gut, so I got up out of bed and peeked out the front window. To my surprise, the odd man was still there, by the fire, alone, just staring into the dying flames. It was creepy, like something out of a horror movie, but at the same time, he wasn't doing us any harm just sitting there, so I tried to shake it off and went back to bed. The next morning, the guy's car was gone. Great, he's left, I thought, feeling relieved. The others were just as happy. We spent the day enjoying various activities. We went for a hike, took pictures, and even played in the river a little bit. But as evening rolled in, and we were walking back to our cabins, we saw that the car was back. "Damn," I muttered out loud. Not wanting to have another odd encounter, we all agreed to hang out in one cabin that night. Nobody was in the mood to bump into Mr. Creepy again. After some time over at our cabin, Mark and Lisa decided to head back to their own. As they did, they saw him, alone by the fire again. As Jade and I got ready for bed, we discussed options for what we could do on our last day. Eventually, we decided that we'd figure it out in the morning and fell asleep. A few hours later, that sleep was interrupted by urgent knocking on our door. It was Mark and Lisa, scared out of their wits. "Someone was peeking through our window," Lisa said in a panic. The mood instantly shifted, and everyone was on high alert. "Was it the guy in the 3rd cabin?" Jade asked. "We don't know. All we saw was a silhouette, and we knew that you guys wouldn't do something like that," Mark replied. Deciding to take a look, I slowly walked over to the door and peeked my head out to get a look at the 3rd cabin. Once again, there was nothing. No lights, no movement, no nothing. Only the lonely car sitting there in the dark. "Stay calm," I told everyone, but my heart was racing. "Let's just all huddle up here and we'll call the host in the morning." And so that's what we did. The next morning, the reply from the host took us completely off guard. "There shouldn't be anyone in the 3rd cabin," she said. "Only the first 2 cabins should be occupied." The news sent a shock through all of us. Upon hearing it, Jade did just as I had done earlier, and peeked her head out the front door to get a look at the 3rd cabin. "The car is gone," she said. Eventually, the cops made their way out. A search ensued, but there was no trace of the creepy man. What they did find, however, was evidence that whoever this person was, he discreetly broke a small area of a window to unlock it and enter into the cabin. The cops took our statement, and we did our best to provide a description of the man and his vehicle. But the man never returned, and was never found. That weekend was supposed to be a break from our regular lives, but it ended up being a story we'd tell for years to come, not for the reasons we'd hoped. Every time I think about it, I get this uneasy feeling, like we dodged something serious. It's strange how a place so serene can harbor something so unsettling. Ever since then, I've been a bit more cautious about where we stay, and who else may be staying there. You just never know who you might run into. Story 3. There's Someone in the Woods. Our Airbnb getaway began as a dream, a weekend escape to a secluded cabin in the heart of the woods. Gabby, my fiancée, and I were seeking a peaceful retreat from our busy lives and the whirlwind of wedding planning. The cabin, nestled in a thick forest, seemed like a hidden gem. The drive to the cabin was a journey into tranquility, the city's noise fading behind us as we ventured deeper into the wilderness. Upon arrival, the cabin was as picturesque as its online photos, a beautiful haven surrounded by nature's beauty. We spent the first day exploring the surrounding woods. Gabby's laughter, free and unburdened, echoed through the trees, creating a sense of blissful isolation. That evening, we prepared a modest yet delicious dinner in the quaint kitchen. The cabin's ambiance, enhanced by the soft glow of candles and the warmth of the fireplace, made the meal feel intimate. We retired early, contented by the day's adventures. The serene atmosphere of our first day, however, did not last. On the second day, as I was preparing breakfast, Gabby stepped out to retrieve something from the car. I was sipping away on my coffee when a sudden scream pierced the morning calm. My heart leaped, and I dropped what I was doing and rushed towards the door. As I did, Gabby burst back in, her face pale and eyes wide with fear. "There's someone in the woods," she exclaimed, her voice trembling. "I saw someone watching me from the trees." "Are you sure?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "I think so," she replied, her gaze darting back towards the ominous woods. We cautiously stepped outside, scanning the tree line for any sign of the mysterious watcher. The woods were still, the only sound being the gentle rustle of leaves and the normal sounds of nature. We walked a little further, eyes straining through the shadows and foliage, but there was no one there. "Maybe it was just your imagination," I suggested. Gabby nodded slowly, her eyes still fixed on the trees. "Yeah, maybe," she agreed, though I could tell she wasn't entirely convinced. "Come on," I said as I gave her a little kiss on the cheek. "Some eggs and toast will make you feel better." She gave a slight chuckle, and we made our way back inside. Trying to put the unsettling incident behind us, Gabby and I resumed cooking breakfast. Still a bit shaken, Gabby apologized for the scare. "I'm sorry, I just got spooked out there," she said, her voice still carrying a tremor. I quickly assured her, "Hey, no need to apologize. These woods can play tricks on anyone's eyes." I could tell she was trying to put the incident behind her, eager to return to the sense of normalcy we had planned for this getaway. After breakfast, Gabby, looking more like her usual self, suggested we head out to a nearby overlook. "It's supposed to have a great view. Could be a nice way to spend the morning," she said with a smile. I agreed, thinking a walk might be just what we needed to shake off the morning's odd start. We got ready and set off, following a narrow path that wound through the dense woods toward the overlook. As we walked, the beauty of the forest gradually eased the tension from our shoulders. The sun filtered through the leaves, the birds chirped, and the scent of pine was in the air. It was nature in all its glory. Along our hike, though, something caught my eye. Just off the path, there was a log. There was nothing unusual about the log itself, but what made me pause was the ground beneath it. The leaves and dirt appeared disturbed, as if someone had been sitting there, their feet shuffling and scuffing the ground below. It was a reminder of Gabby's earlier scare, and for a moment I felt a chill run down my spine. However, I chose not to mention it to Gabby. I didn't want to reignite her fear or spoil our walk. We continued on our way, though on the inside I was on high alert. The overlook, when we reached it, was breathtaking. A vast panorama of the forest spread out before us, the river winding like a silver ribbon in the distance. For a while we stood there in silence, taking in the view. It was moments like these that we had come for. A chance to connect with nature and each other, away from the worries of the world. On our way back from the overlook, Gabby and I were in high spirits, though I was still somewhat on guard. We joked and laughed, holding hands as we strolled through the woods. The rest of the day was spent in lazy contentment. We played some board games, cooked a simple yet delicious meal together, and as the evening set in, we decided to watch a movie. After the movie, we nestled into bed, and after a few minutes, we both fell asleep. A few hours later, a noise at the front door jerked me awake. I lay there for a moment, straining my ears in the darkness. Gabby was still asleep beside me, and I didn't want to wake her with what I hoped was just my imagination running wild again. Moving as silently as I could, I got out of bed and tiptoed towards the front door to investigate. As I approached it, I could see a shadow moving through the window. I couldn't make out what it was, but I told myself that it was probably just some animal. As I inched closer, though, my face now only a few inches from the door's window, a jolt of shock snapped through me when a man suddenly stepped into view. We were just feet apart, separated only by the glass of the door. Our eyes locked, and I could see the shock in his eyes as clearly as he could see mine. Panic surged through me. Without thinking, I yelled, "Hey!" as loud as I could. Gabby's voice, filled with panic and confusion, called out from the bedroom, "What's happening?" The man, startled by my yell, turned and ran into the woods. My heart still racing, I ensured that the door was locked and rushed back to the bedroom. "Someone was outside," I said to Gabby, trying to keep my voice steady. "I saw him right at the front door." Gabby sat up, her eyes wide with fear. "What do we do?" she asked. "We need to leave immediately," I said urgently. "It'll take hours for the cops to get here, if we can even get a signal." She nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. She scrambled out of bed, hastily throwing on her clothes. My mind raced with thoughts of the man at the door and the earlier incident with Gabby. Had he been watching us this whole time? We hurried to the car, not bothering to pack our belongings. Every second felt precious, and my only thought was to put as much distance as possible between us and the cabin. As we sped away, I looked at the cabin in the rearview mirror, watching what was supposed to be a blissful weekend with my fiancée disappear into the darkness. Back in town, we contacted the police. They promised to check out the cabin, but by the time they made their way out there, the man was long gone. They found nothing but the quiet woods and our abandoned weekend home. As I recounted the events to the officers, a wave of disappointment washed over me. I should have taken Gabby more seriously when she first mentioned seeing someone in the woods. The signs were there: Gabby's sighting, the disturbed area near the log. I had dismissed them, thinking I was being overly cautious. In doing so, I had put us both in danger. That night, as I lay in bed in the safety of our own home, I made a silent promise to always trust our instincts, to be more aware of our surroundings, and to never underestimate the potential dangers, even in the most serene settings. The experience had been a harsh reminder of the unpredictability of the world, even in places where we seek refuge and peace. Never again, I said to myself, would my neglect put us at risk. Story 4. Horror at the Beach House. Last year, my girlfriend Emily and I decided to rent out an Airbnb for a nice, relaxing weekend. We were a new couple, having only began dating just a few short weeks ago. This trip was our first big adventure together, and I was looking forward to it. We settled on a house on the beach. It was a beautiful place, isolated and surrounded by the vast expanse of the ocean. It seemed perfect. We arrived at the charming little rental on a Friday afternoon with Bo tagging along. Bo is Emily's dog, a 4-year-old golden retriever that enjoys snacks, laying around, and lots of attention. He's been with Emily ever since he was about 6 weeks old, and she can't go anywhere without him. The first evening at the rental was idyllic. We walked along the beach, played with Bo, and even waded around in the ocean a little bit. It was what we had come for, and we were soaking up every minute of it. But as night fell, the atmosphere shifted. We were sitting on the deck, listening to the sound of the waves, when Bo started growling, his gaze fixed on the beach. I tried to see what he was looking at, but the beach was covered in darkness. Emily and I didn't think too much of it. Everyone knows how dogs can get, growling and barking at absolutely nothing. We would soon discover, though, that it wasn't nothing. The next morning, we found something unsettling. Footprints in the sand, right below our deck. They for sure weren't ours. There was something else too, something very disturbing, a message written in the sand that simply said, "I'm watching." Emily tried to brush it off as a prank, but I could see the unease in her eyes. The isolation of the place, once comforting, now felt eerie, as if we were exposed and vulnerable. We tried to put the incident out of our minds, writing it off as some kids passing by on the beach playing around with us or something. Instead, we focused on enjoying our day. We swam in the ocean, built sandcastles with Bo, and tried to soak in the beauty of our surroundings. But the feeling of being watched lingered. That evening, things escalated. As we arrived back at the house, again we found footprints in the sand. This time they led to the back door. As we cautiously entered, Bo trailed behind us. What we saw inside turned my stomach. Our beach house, our haven, was wrecked. The fridge was open, its contents spilled across the floor. Our bedsheets, soaked, were piled in the shower. I felt a mix of anger and fear. Who would do this? Bo's growls broke the eerie silence, sending chills down my spine. I quickly called the police and our Airbnb host, my voice shaking with every word. The police arrived and scoured the place. We told them about the footprints and the message in the sand. They took our statements and asked us if we thought about anybody who could have done this and why. I was dumbfounded. I couldn't think of a single person who would want to do something like this. Emily, on the other hand, was eerily quiet. She mostly sat in the corner and stared out at the beach, like she was contemplating something. In the end, though, the cops found nothing concrete and suggested that we had left the back door unlocked. Emily and I exchanged a look of doubt, though. We were sure we had locked it. Despite everything, we decided to stay another night. I couldn't let this incident drive us away from our weekend retreat. It was our first big weekend together, and I wanted to salvage as much of it as I could. As night fell, we settled into bed, and Bo cozied up by our feet. All was well, until suddenly, in the middle of the night, Bo became restless. His ears perked up, and he stared at the bedroom door with a slight growl. Just as I was about to tell him that everything was okay, I heard a faint sound at the back door. "Did you hear that?" I asked Emily. "Yeah," she replied with a look of fear glazed over her face. With my heart pounding, I got out of bed and crept out of the bedroom and towards the back door. Bo, now more alert than ever, stayed on the bed with Emily, but began to growl even louder. As I made my way around the corner, my heart completely dropped as the back door came into view. There, by the door, was a silhouette of someone. They were just standing there, and they were inside the house. Instinct took over, and I flung on the lights to get a better look at whoever it was that was standing in the house. As the light flicked on, I got a look at the intruder, and instantly everything made sense. It was Emily's ex-boyfriend. She had told me about him, a volatile relationship that had ended badly. He had struggled to accept the breakup, and had made several attempts to contact her since. The thought that he might have followed us here, to this isolated place, was terrifying. I confronted him, demanding to know what he was doing there. Instead of an answer, though, he lunged at me, and in the ensuing struggle, Emily appeared and screamed, trying to pull him off. It was chaos, shouting, lots of cursing, things being knocked over. It wasn't until Bo, who had been barking incessantly, finally joined into the struggle that Emily's ex finally relented and bolted back out the door. It was a chaotic few moments, and everything happened so quickly. My heart was pounding like a jackhammer in my chest, and it took me a moment to process what had just happened. We made another call, and before long, the police were once again on the scene, this time having a lot more to work with. A few days later, the ex was finally located, arrested, and charged with a long list of offenses. It took some time for Emily and me to deal with the aftermath of the incident. We would later find out that the ex had access to Emily's email, and was able to obtain the key code for the back door of the house. Looking back at our stay at that Airbnb, the experience casted a dark shadow over what was meant to be a peaceful getaway. The drive back was quiet, each of us lost in our thoughts, processing the events. Our relationship had gotten off to a rocky start, not by our own doing, of course. But in the end, I feel like it made us lean on each other, helping to strengthen our relationship for the long run. Story 5. A Wolf in Sheep's Clothing. My girlfriend and I have rented plenty of Airbnbs over the years, but none of the experiences that we've had in any of them compared to the one we had in Florida. We'd been planning this getaway for months, the kind of trip where you leave all your worries packed away in the closet back home and just soak up some sunshine. Florida seemed like the perfect escape, a chance for my girlfriend and I to recharge those rundown batteries of ours. I remember us singing to some old 90s hits on the radio as we cruised down the highway, our spirits as high as the clear blue sky. The Airbnb was a picture-perfect beach house, the kind that you'd swear was plucked straight from a postcard. It had this beautiful little porch with a view that overlooked the ocean, where the waves would roll in hypnotically, and the sand was so white it could have been mistaken for sugar. That first day, we did nothing but laze around on that beautiful beach. The sun was bright, and the breeze felt amazing. It was one of those moments when life felt simple. For me, a guy who's been riding the roller coaster of the financial industry for the better part of a decade, simplicity is something I crave more than anything. In that industry, you're always one decision away from a breakthrough or a breakdown, and the pressure can squeeze you tighter than a size too small suit. The next day was more of the same bliss. As we lounged on the beach, a man approached us. He had his 2 kids in tow, a boy and a girl, both with those innocent smiles that make you think of childhood summers. They ran straight for the water, giggling and kicking up sand. The man struck up a conversation, just friendly chit-chat at first, but then he started asking more personal questions. I've always been a bit too open for my own good, so I found myself telling him about my job, how I've been fortunate enough to climb the ladder, and how it's afforded us the luxuries we sometimes take for granted. He seemed genuinely interested, nodding and asking the kind of questions that encourage you to boast a little. He asked where we were staying, and without a second thought, I pointed out our Airbnb, sitting just behind us. He nodded his head and chatted a little bit more before he wrapped up the conversation, herded his kids up, and headed out. My girlfriend and I didn't give it a second thought. Why would we? The guy had kids with him, and who doesn't like talking about their successes every now and then? Little did we know that our sweet little vacation would go from happiness to horror. As the sun went down, we were back inside our temporary slice of paradise. Around 8 p.m., an unexpected knock rattled the front door. My girlfriend and I exchanged puzzled looks, wondering who it could be. I peered through the peephole and was met with the sight of a stranger. "Hello?" I called out, keeping the door shut. The man on the other side was adamant that he'd rented the place for the night. I explained, as calmly as I could, that he was mistaken, that we'd booked the Airbnb for the entire weekend. But he wouldn't let up, his tone growing more demanding by the second. The man pleaded with me to open the door so that we could discuss the mix-up and get it straightened out. But something didn't feel right. Glancing out the window, I saw a car parked on the street with its engine running. It was too convenient, too suspicious. "Sorry, man, I'm not opening the door," I called out. This did not settle well with the man. He began banging on the door violently and kicking it. The encounter was now sending my girlfriend into a panicked frenzy. That's when I remembered. I'd brought my gun, a precaution I took more out of habit than actual concern for needing it. As the man's knocks grew into heavy bangs, I retrieved my gun. I wasn't looking for a confrontation, just something to tip the scales enough for him to back off. "Call the cops," I said to my girlfriend as I retrieved it, and hurried my way back to the window. There, I tapped it against the window, making sure he saw it. His reaction was immediate. He sprinted to the car, jumping in the back seat. As the car peeled away, I got a glimpse at the driver and another man in the front passenger seat. I couldn't believe what I saw. The man, sitting there in the passenger seat, was the man from the beach. The realization hit me like a tidal wave. The questions, the friendly demeanor, it was all an act, a way to scope out potential targets, to catch us off guard. These guys weren't just random opportunists. They were calculated, using a facade of family fun to lower defenses and gather information. When the police arrived, we gave our statement. Turns out, they'd been on the lookout for a group pulling the same con on other tourists. A few weeks later, we heard the news. 3 men arrested, including the guy who'd played the part of the harmless father on the beach. The kids were his niece and nephew, and he was using them as a means to soften his approach to unsuspecting victims, unbeknownst to the kid's mother. It's a strange feeling, knowing you were that close to being a victim of something terrible. It sticks with you. It's a lesson that not every friendly face is what it seems. Anybody could be a wolf in sheep's clothing. Story 6. Vengeful Guest. I've always been a bit of an outdoors guy, but working 60-hour weeks at the office had left me with little time to enjoy the wilderness. That's why when my buddy told me about this cabin in the woods you could rent on Airbnb, I didn't think twice. He said it was a great spot to unwind. So there I was, driving my old Jeep through the dense forest to a place I found online, expecting nothing but the sound of crickets and owls in the night. The cabin was straight out of one of those old wilderness paintings. You know, the ones with the big front porch, a couple of rocking chairs, and that homey feel. I remember pulling up and thinking, this is it. This is perfect. Unloading my stuff, I could feel the stress melting off me with every step I took towards that front door. The first few hours were exactly what I hoped for. I popped open a beer, sat on the porch, and just listened. There was a kind of music to the woods that city life drowns out. As the evening crept in, I grilled a steak and soaked in the solitude. When night fell, I settled in front of the fireplace. The flames flickered and danced, and it was as close to heaven as I'd ever felt. It was cozy, almost hypnotic, but the feeling didn't last. You know that sense you get when you think someone's watching you? I began to feel that, but every time I glanced out the window, I saw nothing, just my own reflection and the dark outline of the trees against the sky. I tried to shake it off and decided to call it a night, hoping sleep would reset everything. But then, just as I was dozing off, I heard a huge bang. It was so loud and sudden. My heart went from 0 to 100 in a blink. I've heard noises in the night before, a branch falling, an animal nosing around. But this was different. This was deliberate. With my heart punching at 100 miles per hour, I approached the door, every horror movie I'd ever seen playing in my head. Opening it, I half expected to be met with some axe murderer's grin. Instead, what I found was a rabbit. It was dead. Its lifeless body looked like it had been thrown there, intentionally. There was no blood, no sign of a struggle, just a motionless body lying there. It didn't add up. The panic that hit wasn't the adrenaline kind you get when you're pumped. It was cold, heavy. It filled my chest and didn't let go. I felt exposed, vulnerable. After I slammed the door shut and dialed the cops, I spent the next hour pacing around the cabin, every creak and crackle of the woodwork making me jump. The officers who showed up were locals, familiar with the woods and the wildlife. They took a look around, their flashlights cutting through the darkness, but they came back with nothing. They said it could be kids messing around or someone with a sick sense of humor. They told me to lock up and call again if anything else happened. But even after they left, the sense of security that should have come with their presence just wasn't there. The next day, I reached out to the host, a nice enough guy who seemed as perplexed as I was. He confirmed no one had ever reported anything like this before. Nevertheless, the harrowing ordeal soured my excitement for the retreat, and I canceled the rest of my reservation. As the weeks passed on, the events of that night never left my mind. With curiosity clawing at me, I kept track of the listings' reviews, seeing if anyone had experienced anything similar to what I had. Stories from other guests trickled in, each one with a tale of late-night frights, things just weird enough to make you want to leave and never come back. A few months later, the full picture of what was truly going on out at that cabin came to light. Late one night, the cops pulled over a guy for speeding, not very far from the cabin. As they spoke with the individual, he seemed nervous and erratic. Upon closer inspection of his vehicle, there in the trunk of his car, they found a dead rabbit. After pressing the man for some time, he admitted to being the one behind the disturbances. He was a previous guest, a vengeful guest, who'd had some minor disagreement with the host. His way of getting back was to sabotage the cabin's reputation, to drive guests away with fear, hoping they'd plaster the internet with bad reviews. When I think back on that weekend, my mind is a mix of anger towards the vengeful guest and sadness for the host. It's a story I've shared with some of my friends, a modern-day cautionary tale of how far some people will go over the smallest things. And while I still love the woods, maybe next time, I'll go somewhere with a few more people around, just in case. Story 7. Fog over the farmhouse. When my wife and I initially planned our Austin getaway with close friends, we meticulously picked an Airbnb that seemed perfect for our long weekend, a quaint spot right in the heart of the city. close to bustling bistros and the indie music scene we were so eager to immerse ourselves in. But as luck would have it, a last-minute plumbing catastrophe at our chosen locale left us scrambling for a plan B. Scouring the internet for another place wasn't just frustrating, it was downright stressful, knowing that our well-planned vacation hung precariously in the balance. We finally found a place, though it was a stretch beyond our budget. The listing showcased a modern farmhouse with an aesthetic that seemed straight out of a high-end home magazine. It promised seclusion and tranquility, a stark contrast to our original urban pick, but with our options running low, we took the plunge. The hosts were responsive, and within an hour, we had our new accommodation lined up. Our GPS guided us through the outskirts of Austin until we turned down a gravel path that led to the property. That's when the butterflies in my stomach started fluttering wildly. A towering wrought iron gate stood guard at the entrance, the kind you'd expect at the forefront of some old estate, not a rental property. I felt a mix of curiosity and an inexplicable wariness as I stepped out to punch in the gate code. My eyes couldn't help but wander over to the left, where a small cemetery lay under the shadow of knotted oak trees. The tombstones were weathered and worn, suggesting they'd been there for generations. To our right, a sprawling car junkyard with rusted heaps scattered haphazardly overgrown with Texas sagebrush presented a stark juxtaposition to the deathly silence of the cemetery. The scene was peculiar. Such an odd trio: a cemetery, a junkyard, and a stunning modern farmhouse. As we waited for the gate to draw open, I couldn't shake off the eerie sensation that we were stepping into a chapter of Austin's history that few knew about. When the gate finally creaked open, we drove down the winding path, flanked on both sides by towering fence posts that felt more like sentinels than mere decorations. When the farmhouse came into view, it was as though we'd stepped onto a movie set designed to embody rustic elegance. The wraparound porch was adorned with rocking chairs and hanging plants that swayed gently in the breeze, almost as if greeting us. We grabbed our bags and made our way to the front door, trying to shake off the disconcerting welcome committee we'd just passed. The moment we entered, the feeling of unease began to dissolve. The interior of the farmhouse was breathtaking. The crystal chandelier hanging in the foyer cast a kaleidoscope of light across the walls. The vaulted ceiling soared high above us, and the loft overlooking the living area hinted at cozy evenings. It was clear the house was designed with love, every detail meticulously chosen to create a sense of warmth and luxury. We explored each room with growing excitement, admiring the blend of rustic charm and modern amenities, unaware that the strange occurrences of the night would soon give us a new, less inviting perspective of this beautiful abode. The sun had dipped below the horizon when the charm of the house began to unravel, and a less welcoming ambiance took its place. At first it was the flickering of lights that caught our attention, an occasional dimming that would have been easy to dismiss as a quirk of rural living if not for the precision with which it happened, as if someone were playing with a dimmer switch. We joked about it, making light of the situation, but an unsettling undercurrent ran through our laughter. The noises from outside, too, became a topic of nervous jest. They were peculiar, rustlings and the occasional clank that sounded like it was coming from the junkyard, as if the metallic carcasses were settling in for the night. The unease solidified the next morning when we woke to a landscape swallowed by fog. It was a dense, enveloping fog, the kind that dampens sounds and makes the world feel smaller, more constricted. We had planned to explore Austin that day, but the fog was a thick white curtain, impenetrable and unyielding, delaying our departure. It seemed to press against the windows with an almost sentient force, and I found myself peering into the milky whiteness, half expecting something to be looking back. There was a stillness, a silence that pressed upon our ears, save for the occasional drip of condensation from the eaves. The fog didn't lift until well past noon, and by then, our enthusiasm for venturing out had dampened considerably. That second night, the shift from odd to outright alarming occurred. I had fallen into a restless sleep, only to be jolted awake by the unmistakable feeling of being touched. It was a firm pressure on my shoulder, like a hand trying to roll me over. I snapped upright, my breath caught in my throat, but there was nothing there, just the shadowy corners of the room and the soft sound of my wife's breathing, undisturbed beside me. The room felt colder than before, and I wrapped the blanket tighter around myself, trying to convince my racing heart that it was just a dream. But sleep remained elusive. Each creak and groan of the house now felt like a harbinger of something lurking just out of sight. During the days, the attic door would catch my eye, as if it were calling out to be noticed. It sat atop of the loft, inconspicuously placed, but somehow foreboding. The note from the owners echoed in my mind, a seemingly nonchalant request to avoid the attic, which now piqued our curiosity with a morbid sort of allure. Why emphasize this single off-limits area in such a lavishly welcoming home? Each time I passed by the door, a chill would trace the length of my spine, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being closely watched, as though eyes were tracking my every move, bidding their time until curiosity would win out. The mystery of the attic consumed my thoughts. The peculiar old door, with its faded paint and antique handle, seemed to hold secrets just beyond reach. Throughout our stay, the door had been a subtle presence in the back of my mind, an enigmatic piece of the farmhouse's puzzle that the owner's note had turned into an almost forbidden fruit. Their casual warning, intended to deter, had only stoked the flames of curiosity. Was it merely storage, a place for forgotten heirlooms, or something more? I found myself concocting theories, each more outlandish than the last, but the truth remained locked away, just as we were instructed to leave it. That evening, the sense of an unseen presence became overwhelming. As the shadows lengthened and merged, the farmhouse felt less like a sanctuary and more like a vessel for something malevolent and watching. The charged air seemed to hum with silent chords of unease. I wrestled with the thought of leaving without exploring the attic, without understanding what lay beyond that door, which seemed to serve as a boundary between the known and the unknown. In the thick of our packing, a small, forgotten photograph fell from between the cushions of the plush sofa. It depicted the farmhouse, or rather, an older, more primitive version of it, standing solemnly in black and white. The people in the picture, a group that could have been a family, bore grim expressions that were common in pictures of the era, but seemed to carry a particular weight here. They were dressed in somber attire, typical of a bygone century, standing rigid and stoic before the house. On the back, scrawled in ink that had faded to a ghost of its original self, were the words, "They don't rest." The message sent a shiver down my spine, and I couldn't help but feel as though the eyes of the photographed faces were staring straight through me, their somber gazes heavy with a tale untold. That final night, the house felt like it was closing in on us. The dense fog returned with a vengeance, as if the previous day's phenomenon was just a rehearsal. The fog was a thick shroud outside, more oppressive than ever, and it seemed to leach into the farmhouse, muffling sound and casting everything in a haze. The flickering of the lights escalated into a frenetic dance, leaving us in alternating moments of stark illumination and suffocating darkness. The unexplained noises grew louder, more frequent, and seemed to surround the house. Sounds that I had tried to write off as wildlife or the wind now took on a more desperate quality, a cacophony that seemed to be closing in on us from all sides. They were no longer just the benign settling of an old structure, but carried a sense of intention, as if the house itself was trying to communicate through creaks and groans. It was as if the very essence of the farmhouse was altered, the once welcoming atmosphere replaced by a pressing, ominous dread. Every hair on my body stood on end, a primal reaction to the feeling of being hunted or haunted. Our conversation dwindled to whispers, our movements to cautious steps, the sense of urgency to leave growing with every heartbeat. Sleep was a battle lost before it began. Our last night was spent in a state of vigilance, a long drawn-out moment suspended in the strange energy that enveloped the farmhouse. We barely spoke, each of us lost in our own unease, counting the minutes until the sky would begin to lighten. When the first weak rays of dawn finally broke through the fog, we were already packed and ready, the car loaded with a haste born of fear. As we drove away, the house receded into the fog like a specter retreating into oblivion. The tightness in my chest eased with each mile we put between us and the farmhouse, but a cascade of questions remained. We left not with the contentment of a holiday's end, but with the ragged edges of an experience that would haunt us for a long time to come. The relief of departure was tinged with the unease of unresolved mysteries, and the lingering sensation of eyes that might still be watching from the windows of that modern farmhouse, hidden away in the embrace of Austin's foggy outskirts.
Story 8. A creepy voice looking for Caroline. In the middle of summer, my boyfriend John and I decided to take a long weekend. We were craving adventure and the great outdoors. What happened instead was one of the creepiest experiences either of us have ever been through. Had I not been there myself, I wouldn't have believed that it happened. A weekend in the Appalachian Mountains seemed like the perfect escape. I managed to find a quaint cabin on Airbnb that promised to be both secluded and picturesque. We were only the third or fourth people to book it since it was newly listed. The cabin lived up to its promise. It was surrounded by a dense expanse of trees with a spectacular view of the mountains. Every corner was meticulously designed, blending modern comfort with a rustic touch. However, what really caught my attention was an old radio on a side table in the living room. It felt out of place, but in an oddly charming way. Its wooden exterior, worn-out knobs, and a big speaker at the center gave the cabin a touch of vintage elegance. On our second morning there, while we were fixing breakfast, the radio abruptly blared to life, filling the room with loud static. We froze, startled by the sudden noise. As we approached it, I could faintly make out a voice. All I could make out, though, was the name Caroline. John quickly switched it off, attributing the unexpected turn-on to faulty wiring. That evening, we relaxed on the balcony with our drinks. The chirping of crickets and distant owl hoots was therapeutic, but the tranquility was shattered when, once again, the radio spontaneously turned on. Static, a voice, and then the word Caroline. It was more distinct this time, and eerie. Feeling a mix of curiosity and unease, we discussed the bizarre occurrences. Deciding we didn't want to be interrupted by the radio again, John unplugged it, and I stowed it away in a closet. The following morning, I recounted the eerie radio incidents to our Airbnb host over a call. She sounded genuinely surprised, mentioning that no previous guests had reported anything unusual. "Just keep it in the closet. It's probably just old and acting up," she said. Taking her advice, we unplugged the radio, placed it in the closet, and went about our day. It was the perfect day. We hiked trails and relaxed by a nearby river. With the sun shining, birds singing, and nature surrounding us, the radio was soon forgotten. However, our peace was rudely interrupted that night. Just as we were drifting to sleep, the radio blared loudly from the closet, the noise startling and ear-piercing. John, a touch of fear in his eyes, approached the closet. But just as he was about to open the door, the radio fell silent. Pulling the door open, he discovered the unplugged radio sitting innocently on the shelf. We both looked at each other, wide-eyed, creeped out, and confused. Not knowing what else to do, John carried the radio outside and locked it in the trunk of our car. It was a mostly sleepless night, but the silence remained unbroken. The next morning, although it was our last day, we couldn't shake off the unease. We decided to cut our stay short by a few hours. John retrieved the radio, placing it back inside the cabin, and we headed home, eager to put the unsettling experience behind us. About a month later, I received a call from the Airbnb host. She wanted to share something interesting that she had found. A recent guest had stumbled upon an old headstone while hiking in the woods near the cabin. The grave, dated back to the 1930s, had the name Caroline on it. The host dove deep into some research. She uncovered the tragic story of Caroline, a 9-year-old girl who vanished in the 1930s. Her disappearance and the discovery of her lifeless body happened over a 2-day period, eerily corresponding with the 2 days the radio had acted up during our stay. It was believed she was abducted and cruelly murdered. The realization made my skin crawl. To this day, John and I can't shake off that eerie radio that seemed to come to life on the same days as this poor girl that went missing. Some things, I guess, will never be explained.
Story 9. The Uninvited Guest. I had been driving for hours, eager to get away from the city noise and spend a weekend alone in a remote cabin. The stresses of my day-to-day job had been taking a toll on me, and I needed a break. I had found a cabin on Airbnb that seemed perfect, secluded, surrounded by woods, and with an amazing view of a serene lake. The reviews were all positive, with guests praising the quiet beauty of the place. When I arrived, the sun was setting. The cabin was amazing, made of dark timber with large windows that allowed a beautiful view of the surroundings. After unloading my stuff and making a quick dinner, I settled in the living area with a book. The darkness outside enveloped the cabin quickly, but as the hours ticked by, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I tried to brush it off, attributing it to the unfamiliarity of the woods and the innate fear of the unknown that many of us have. After all, I was alone in a remote area. When I decided to turn in for the night, I made sure all the windows and doors were locked. My room had a large window facing the dense woods. Lying in bed, the eeriness of the silence felt profound. The earlier peace I felt was replaced by an unsettling quiet. Somewhere around 1 a.m., a creak in the floorboard of the front porch jolted me awake. At first I thought it was just an animal or something, but as I listened closely, it sounded more like footsteps. Trying not to panic, I sat up, straining my ears to pinpoint the source. The sound grew louder, and I could now clearly hear footsteps approaching the front door. Every so often they would stop, and a heavy silence would take over, only to be interrupted again by the steps. I dared not move, afraid to make any noise. The only source of light was the dim moonlight filtering through the windows. Suddenly, a shadow peeked around the corner of the window in the door. I was paralyzed by fear. The silhouette seemed to be of a tall man, but the features were indistinguishable. He pressed his face against the window, and I could see his breath fogging it up. His eyes were wide open, devoid of any emotion, staring directly at me. Our eyes locked, and though he made no move to enter or break down the door, the mere intensity of his gaze made my blood run cold. It felt like an eternity, but eventually he pulled away from the window and the sound of his footsteps slowly faded into the distance. I stayed frozen in my bed, too terrified to move. When dawn finally broke, the terror of the night gave way to the beautiful serenity of the morning. Gathering my courage, I decided to inspect the perimeter of the cabin. My heart sank when I saw the multiple sets of footprints, confirming what I already knew. Rushing inside, I immediately called the local police. They arrived within the hour, and I relayed the entire ordeal to them. They conducted a thorough search of the surrounding woods but didn't find anybody. However, they did find a campsite on the other side of the hill, not far from the cabin, which seemed to have been recent, but abandoned now. Not feeling completely safe anymore, I cut my trip short. I informed my Airbnb host of the incident, and they promised to look into the matter. I often wonder what would have happened if that creepy man had decided to do more than just watch that night. I've honestly never been so scared before in my life. It's a very unsettling feeling of knowing that you're being watched, and not knowing the intent of the person watching you. It's been a while since I've rented another Airbnb. I haven't sworn them off altogether, but I do believe my next rental won't be so isolated and remote. Story 10. We spent the night with a presence. Late last fall, my wife and I decided to take a few days off to go visit my parents. Rather than flying, we decided to make a trip of it and drive, taking our cat Sam along with us. We would leave on a Friday afternoon, stay the night in an Airbnb, and then make the rest of the trip Saturday morning. We booked 2 different Airbnbs, one for the trip down and another for the trip back. Our first Airbnb was at a somewhat remote cottage, into the woods a little bit but not too far off from our path. A nice private getaway for the night, we thought. We arrived around sunset and the house was dark. As we parked, I couldn't help but feel a sense of being watched. As we stepped inside, it felt like we had interrupted someone. even though all the lights were off. My wife whispered, "Feels like we're not alone, doesn't it?" I nodded, feeling relieved that I wasn't the only one with that sensation. Sam immediately hid behind the couch, his tail puffed up, which was really weird. Walking through the cottage, we confirmed there was no one else present. We decided to shake off our unease and settle in for the evening. After a light meal and some wine, we decided to head to bed. Choosing a bedroom was odd. The first one we entered was ice cold, which was strange because the rest of the house was comfortably warm. We opted for a different room. Sam was quite uneasy. He kept staring at the door and occasionally hissing. Trying to reassure ourselves, we joked that maybe he saw a ghost. The eeriness intensified around 3 a.m. I was jolted awake by a creaking noise. My wife, still half asleep, mumbled, "Did you hear that?" As my eyes adjusted to the dark, I swear I saw the door to the bedroom slowly move. Sam hissed violently, his eyes fixated on it. Panicking, I reached for my phone's flashlight. As I did, my wife grabbed my arm. "I swear I just saw someone standing by the door in the hall." I got up and carefully checked, but found nothing. We were honestly so creeped out that we thought of leaving, but it was pitch black outside. Plus, we weren't sure if we were overreacting. To calm our nerves, we decided to chat with the presence. It may sound strange, but it felt like the right thing to do. "Hello," I began, trying not to sound fearful. "We're just visitors here. We mean no harm. If there's someone here, know that we respect you and your home. We'll be leaving tomorrow morning. Please, let's coexist peacefully." My wife chuckled nervously. "Yeah, please don't scare Sam or us. We just need one night." To our surprise, after our impromptu conversation, the ambiance felt lighter. The unsettling presence seemed to diminish, and even Sam curled up and relaxed. The next morning, as we were prepping to leave, we discussed the previous night. We both agreed that we had sensed something, but after our chat, it felt like an understanding had been reached. However, we were curious. I decided to message the Airbnb host, inquiring subtly if any past guests had shared similar experiences. The reply was swift. "Never heard of anything like that. Hope you had a comfortable stay nonetheless." Although her response was nonchalant, it didn't sit well with me. I wondered if she knew more, but was reluctant to share. We wrapped up our stay, ensuring we left the cottage exactly as we had found it. We didn't include our eerie experience in the Airbnb review. After all, how do you tell someone their property might have an unseen guest without sounding crazy? But the experience stayed with us. And oddly enough, both my wife and I have spoken about possibly revisiting the cottage. Although freaked out, we both left there with a sense of excitement and adventure. Maybe next time, we'll get more answers.